My name is Claire Bennett, and for 6 years I was the kind of employee companies say they value but never actually notice. I worked on the 14th floor of Hamilton and Crow Consulting, the kind of glass building where everyone wears expensive suits and talks about leadership culture, even when the real work is being done quietly by people no one remembers to thank. I was always the first person in the office, usually around 7:15 in the morning, fixing spreadsheets that had broken overnight, and reviewing reports that managers were supposed to prepare, but somehow always landed on my desk. I wrote the automation scripts that cut our department's workload in half, created forecasting models that executives proudly showed in meetings, and even built the internal guides everyone used every morning to figure out what needed to be done. Those guides became a routine for the entire department. Every day at exactly 8 in the morning I would send a simple email explaining the day's priorities, common problems, and quick fixes for the systems we used. Everyone relied on them, but nobody ever mentioned where they came from. At first I didn't mind because I believed something very simple. If you work hard enough, eventually someone notices. I started the job when I was 24 with that exact belief. I said yes to every request, stayed late when others left, and volunteered to solve problems no one else wanted to touch. Slowly my life began revolving around the office. I missed my sister's engagement dinner because my manager Todd needed one quick revision for a presentation that wasn't even due until the next day. I canceled a weekend trip with my best friend because a client requested a new report, and Todd said I was the only one who could handle it. Once I even left my father's birthday dinner early because my phone kept buzzing with messages about a spreadsheet error that technically wasn't even my responsibility. My father tried to smile when I stood up to leave the restaurant, but before I walked out he said something that stayed with me for years. He looked straight at me and said quietly, "Don't let them take everything from you." At the time I laughed and told him it was just work, that things would slow down eventually, that sacrifices were normal if you wanted to succeed. But the truth was things didn't slow down. They only became heavier. 2 years into the job a new employee joined our department named Brandon Hayes. Brandon had an MBA, a confident handshake, and the kind of loud personality that filled a room before he even sat down. Todd liked him immediately. Within 2 weeks Brandon was sitting in strategy meetings I had never even been invited to. Within a month he was presenting reports that I had spent days preparing. One afternoon he walked over to my desk holding a document I had worked on for 3 straight nights. He flipped through the pages, nodded approvingly, and said casually, "This looks great, I'll present it tomorrow." I remember staring at him, confused, asking what he meant by that. He just shrugged and said Todd wanted someone with leadership presence in the room. That phrase stuck with me because I understood what it really meant. Leadership presence meant someone louder, someone confident enough to speak over people, someone who looked the part of a future executive. It didn't mean the quiet woman who built the entire system behind the presentation. 6 months later my annual performance review arrived. I walked into Todd's office nervous but hopeful because I truly believed my work had proven my value. He skimmed through my file, leaned back in his chair, and said I was a solid employee. Solid. Then he added that I was reliable. Reliable. Finally he closed the folder and said my work was adequate. That word echoed in my head like an insult disguised as praise. Adequate meant replaceable. Adequate meant invisible. I left the office with the strange feeling that 6 years of effort had been reduced to a single forgettable word. That night I visited my parents, and my mother immediately noticed something was wrong. She said I looked exhausted, but I brushed it off until my father asked what had happened. I told him everything. The meeting where my work was presented without my name, the promotions I was never considered for, the performance review that called my effort adequate. My father listened quietly, and then asked one simple question that completely changed how I saw my job. He asked, "Who would notice if you stopped?" I didn't understand at first, so he clarified. "What would happen," he asked, "if I stopped fixing everyone's mistakes, stopped answering every message, stopped writing those daily guides the entire department depended on?" The thought made me uncomfortable because I had never considered that possibility. My entire identity at work was built around being helpful, dependable, available. The idea of stopping felt almost rebellious. For another month I kept doing the same things, but something inside me had shifted. I began observing the department differently. I noticed that every major workflow depended on systems I had built. The forecasting spreadsheets everyone used had formulas I designed. The automation tools that updated reports overnight were scripts I wrote. The troubleshooting manuals new employees relied on were documents I created during late nights when no one else wanted the task. Most people assumed those systems had always existed. They didn't realize they existed because I built them quietly without asking for recognition. The moment that finally broke me happened by accident. One evening I was walking past the conference room when I heard Todd speaking inside. The door was slightly open, and he was talking to another manager about promotions. I heard my name and stopped without meaning to listen. Todd said Claire was dependable, which was why she was perfect exactly where she was. The other manager asked if I had promotion potential. Todd laughed and said no, that I was more of a support player. I stood there frozen in the hallway realizing that no matter how hard I worked, I would always be the background character in someone else's success story. That night I went home, opened my laptop, and looked at everything I had created over 6 years. The scripts, the documents, the guides, the processes. Then I asked myself a question I had never asked before. What would happen if all of this disappeared? The answer was obvious. The department wouldn't collapse instantly, but it would start breaking slowly, piece by piece, until someone finally realized how much invisible work had been holding everything together. For the first time in a long time I felt something close to calm. The next morning at exactly 8 o'clock, something unusual happened. The daily guide email that everyone expected never arrived. At 8:17 a coworker messaged me asking where it was. I didn't respond. At 8:30 another message appeared asking for help with the forecasting sheet. I ignored that too. By 9 o'clock Brandon walked over to my desk looking confused and slightly irritated. He asked why the automation dashboard hadn't updated overnight. I looked at him calmly and said I had no idea. He stared at me and reminded me that I had built the system. I simply shrugged and said maybe someone else should take a look at it. That was the moment the balance quietly began to shift, even though nobody around me realized it yet. For the first time since I joined the company, I stopped carrying the entire department on my shoulders, and the silence that followed felt louder than any argument I could have started. What none of them understood in that moment was that the systems they relied on were about to reveal something important. The most invisible person in the room had always been the one holding everything together. And when that person finally stepped back, the entire company was about to discover how fragile their success really was. My phone started vibrating before 9:30 that morning. At first it was just one notification, then another, until the corner of my screen was filled with unread messages. Normally I would have answered immediately, but that day I simply watched them appear one after another while sipping my coffee. Someone asked where the daily guide was. Someone else asked how to fix a broken column in the forecasting spreadsheet. Another message asked why the dashboard numbers hadn't refreshed overnight. For 6 years those questions never reached anyone else, because I had always answered them before they became problems. That morning I didn't answer at all. By 10 o'clock the department felt different. You could sense the confusion in the air like static electricity before a storm. People were whispering to each other, checking documents, refreshing systems that suddenly weren't behaving the way they expected. Brandon passed my desk twice, clearly frustrated, holding a laptop like it had personally betrayed him. Finally he stopped in front of me and asked again about the automation script that usually updated our reports every morning. I told him calmly that I wasn't sure what the issue was. He stared at me, confused, as if I had suddenly started speaking a different language. For the first time since he joined the company, he actually looked uncertain. The truth was simple. The script wasn't broken. It just required a small manual step that I had always performed quietly before anyone arrived. Without that step the system simply waited. Brandon eventually walked away, muttering something about IT. And for the rest of the morning I watched the department struggle with problems that had never existed publicly before because I had always solved them privately. Around noon Todd called an unexpected meeting. Everyone gathered in the conference room looking tense. The dashboard projections were wrong, 2 client reports were delayed, and apparently 3 people had tried to fix the forecasting sheet and ended up breaking the formulas completely. Todd looked irritated but still confident in the way managers do when they believe problems will magically fix themselves. He asked if anyone knew what had happened to the daily guides. Nobody answered. Finally, Brandon mentioned that he thought Claire usually sent them. Todd turned toward me, slightly surprised, as if he had just realized something small but mildly inconvenient. "Claire, did you forget to send the guide this morning?" he asked. I shrugged and said I had been focusing on my assigned work. He frowned but didn't push further. The meeting continued with people offering guesses and theories, none of which were correct. By the time we left the room, it was obvious the department was running slower than usual. Small tasks were taking twice as long. People were interrupting each other for help. Questions that normally disappeared in seconds were floating around unanswered. I stayed quiet and continued working only on the tasks actually written in my job description. For the first time in years, my day felt strangely calm. No extra messages, no emergency fixes, no quiet heroics happening behind the scenes. But the rest of the department felt the opposite. Over the next few days, the cracks widened. Reports started missing their internal deadlines. A client presentation had to be delayed because the analytics model produced inconsistent numbers when someone modified the structure I had originally designed. Brandon tried to take control of the situation by organizing a systems improvement task force, which was a very impressive way of saying nobody understood how the systems actually worked. The irony was almost painful. The tools they relied on every day had been built by someone they considered merely adequate. Without that invisible maintenance, those tools were slowly becoming unpredictable. By Thursday afternoon, the confusion had grown into open frustration. People were staying late trying to figure out why processes that once felt effortless were suddenly complicated. Todd began asking more questions about the guides I used to send every morning. I told him the truth. They weren't part of my official responsibilities. He seemed surprised by that answer, as if the idea had never occurred to him. Later that evening, Brandon approached my desk again, this time with a noticeably different tone. He asked if I could quickly explain how the automation dashboard connected to the forecasting system. I told him it was a bit complicated and suggested he review the documentation. The documentation, of course, was something I had written months earlier, but nobody had ever bothered to read because it was easier to ask me directly. Brandon tried to skim through it for 10 minutes before giving up and asking me again for help. I politely told him I was currently focused on another assignment. The look on his face was a mixture of irritation and disbelief. That moment revealed something fascinating about workplace dynamics. People become very uncomfortable when the quiet person who always solves problems suddenly stops doing so. The following Monday, things escalated further. One of our largest clients requested an urgent analysis update, and the internal model produced numbers that didn't match the previous week's projections. Todd spent almost an hour trying to figure out what had changed. Eventually, someone discovered that a small adjustment in the spreadsheet had triggered a chain reaction across several formulas. That spreadsheet, of course, had originally been designed to prevent exactly that kind of mistake, but only if someone maintained the structure correctly. When Todd asked who built the model in the first place, the room went silent for a moment before someone finally said my name. He looked genuinely surprised. For the first time in 6 years, he began asking detailed questions about systems I had quietly created. I answered politely but briefly, offering just enough information to clarify the situation without volunteering to repair it myself. That was the subtle shift that changed everything. Instead of instantly fixing the problem the way I always had, I simply explained what the issue was and let the team handle it. The process took them the rest of the afternoon. Watching them struggle wasn't satisfying in the way revenge stories usually describe, but it was enlightening. It showed me how much invisible labor had been silently supporting everyone else's success. By Wednesday, the executives upstairs had started noticing the department's declining efficiency. Emails began circulating about missed internal benchmarks and delayed deliverables. Todd looked stressed for the first time since I had known him. During another meeting, he asked the team if anyone had suggestions for restoring the workflow we used to have. Several people mentioned the daily guides again, saying they helped everyone stay aligned. Todd turned toward me slowly and asked why I had stopped sending them. I explained calmly that they had always been something extra I did voluntarily, and that I was currently focusing on my assigned responsibilities. The room fell quiet because nobody had a response prepared for that answer. For years they had treated that extra work as if it simply existed without effort. Hearing that it came from a single person forced them to reconsider something they had ignored. After the meeting, Brandon approached me again, this time noticeably less confident than usual. He asked if I could at least bring the guides back temporarily until the department stabilized. I told him I would consider it if management decided to formally include it in my role, and acknowledge the responsibility. The request clearly surprised him. Until that moment, it had never occurred to anyone that the quiet systems keeping the department running might actually belong to someone who deserved recognition. That afternoon I sat at my desk watching the office move around me with a new sense of awareness. Nothing dramatic had happened yet. No confrontations, no dramatic speeches, no big victories. But something deeper had shifted beneath the surface. For the first time, the department was starting to understand how much of its stability had depended on someone they barely noticed. And the realization was spreading slowly through the office like a quiet ripple in still water. What they didn't know yet was that this was only the beginning, because once people start recognizing the value of the person they ignored for years, the balance of power begins to change in ways nobody expects. By the beginning of the third week, the entire department felt like it was running through mud. Every process that once seemed effortless had become slow, confusing, and full of small mistakes. People were staying late again, but not in the quiet, productive way they used to when deadlines approached. This was different. This was frustration. Conversations in the hallways were sharper, emails were shorter, and the confident rhythm the department once had was completely gone. I continued doing exactly what my job description required, nothing more and nothing less. For the first time in years, I was leaving the office at a normal hour, eating dinner without staring at my phone, and sleeping without the anxiety of knowing a midnight message might demand another quick fix. It felt strange at first, almost like I was breaking an unspoken rule. But the more days passed, the more I realized something important. The company had never asked me to sacrifice everything. I had simply trained them to expect it. The real breaking point came during a Monday morning leadership meeting that I hadn't originally been invited to. Around 10:30 my phone rang. It was Todd, and his voice sounded tight and impatient. He asked me to come to the conference room immediately. When I walked in, I noticed something unusual. Not only was Todd there, but two senior executives from the upper floor were also sitting at the table. Brandon was standing near the screen, flipping through slides that clearly weren't helping him. The dashboard projections were wrong again, and apparently one of our largest clients had noticed the inconsistency during a call earlier that morning. The executives were asking detailed questions about how the system worked, and Brandon kept giving vague answers that only made the situation worse. When Todd saw me enter, he looked almost relieved. He gestured toward a chair and said, "Claire, maybe you can help clarify how this model works." For a moment I simply sat there, looking at the screen that displayed the same system I had built years earlier. I explained calmly that the issue wasn't actually the model itself. The problem was that several structural changes had been made to the spreadsheet during the previous week, without understanding how the formulas connected to the automation script. One of the executives asked who designed the system originally. Todd hesitated before answering, and then quietly said my name. That moment changed the atmosphere in the room. The executive turned toward me with genuine curiosity, and asked how long it had taken to build something that complex. I told him the truth. Several months of testing, adjustments, and late nights making sure it worked reliably. He nodded slowly, then asked why the department seemed unable to maintain it now. No one spoke for a few seconds. Eventually Todd admitted that I had usually handled most of the maintenance work. The executive leaned back in his chair and said something simple but powerful. So the person who understands the system best wasn't involved in the decisions about modifying it? No one had a good answer for that. The meeting ended shortly after that conversation, but the tone had completely shifted. For the first time since I joined the company, the executives upstairs understood that the systems everyone relied on had been quietly built and maintained by someone they had never noticed before. Later that afternoon, Todd came to my desk looking very different from his usual confident self. He asked if we could talk privately. We sat in a small meeting room, near the windows overlooking the city. He started the conversation by saying the department had been struggling more than expected during the past few weeks. Then he admitted something I never thought I would hear from him. He said he hadn't realized how many of the team's processes depended on work I had created. He used the word overlooked. It wasn't an apology exactly, but it was closer than anything I had heard in 6 years. He asked if I would consider helping stabilize the systems again, until the department could reorganize responsibilities. I listened quietly before responding. Then I said something that surprised even me. I told him I was willing to help, but not under the same conditions as before. For years I had quietly filled gaps that were never acknowledged or officially recognized. If the company wanted those systems maintained, then the role needed to exist formally, with proper authority, recognition, and compensation. Todd didn't answer immediately. Instead, he asked what exactly I had in mind. I explained it clearly. A formal systems strategy position, direct involvement in decision-making about internal processes, and recognition for the work that had been supporting the department for years. It wasn't revenge. It wasn't anger. It was simply the truth of what my work had already been worth. Todd said he would have to discuss it with upper management, but I could see from his expression that he understood something important had changed. The quiet employee who once accepted everything without question was no longer invisible. 2 days later, I was asked to attend another meeting, this time with the same executive who had questioned the system earlier in the week. The conversation was surprisingly straightforward. He said the company had reviewed the situation and realized the department's efficiency had dropped significantly without the internal processes I had built. He asked if I would be willing to lead a project to redesign and formalize those systems across multiple departments. The position came with a promotion, a new title, and a salary increase that was larger than anything I had expected. The moment felt surreal. For years I had believed recognition would come naturally if I simply worked hard enough. Instead, it had only arrived when I stopped doing the invisible work that allowed others to overlook me. I accepted the offer, but not because it felt like a victory over anyone. I accepted it because it represented something deeper. The moment I finally understood my own value. A week later, the daily guides returned, but they looked very different. Instead of being quiet emails sent from the background, they were now part of a formal system implemented across multiple teams. The automation tools were redesigned with proper documentation and shared oversight. And the invisible labor that had once gone unnoticed was now recognized as a core part of how the company operated. Brandon eventually adjusted to the new structure, though he was noticeably quieter during meetings. Todd treated me differently as well, often asking for input before decisions were made instead of after problems appeared. The department slowly regained its efficiency, but the balance had shifted permanently. One evening as I left the building, I thought about the question my father had asked months earlier. Who would notice if you stopped? The answer had turned out to be everyone, but only after the silence forced them to see what had always been there. The real lesson wasn't about revenge or proving anyone wrong. It was about something much simpler and far more powerful. Sometimes the most important change in a workplace doesn't happen when someone fights louder or works harder. Sometimes it happens the moment the quiet person who carries everything finally decides to set it down. And when that happens, the entire room suddenly realizes who was holding the weight all along.